Venat is just another person, no more predisposed to making the right choices than anyone else. When we learn she's Heidelin, the most fitting and narratively sincere thing would have been to convey she is flawed and imperfect, no more ascended in thought or ideals than any of her brethren. However, her human aspects aren't explored because she has to be right and good first and foremost. Even as the story tries to demonize the notion of perfection, it presents her as an instance of it to exaggerated degrees in a friendship of record, with little need to change, to an extent that is not really credible. When the aim behind writing a character is making the audience like them, it rarely leads to great things, and the story desperately wants to sell the audience on seeing her a particular way, regardless of what she does, even if her actions are ones the narrative had thoroughly condemned up until this point. It seemed like the writers weren't sure how to reconcile the character of Venat with that of Heidelin, who was already established. So many points were left vague, likely in the hopes people would think about it and just go along with the themes. Keeping the audience from hating her seemed more important than the coherence of the message. What we ended up with was a create-your-own character, where people can focus on different scenes and dialogues to assign their own motivations to her. The result is most people like her, but there's little consistency in interpretation of the thoughts and feelings behind her behavior. Any individual part can be justified with some conjecture, but in aggregate, it collapses under its own weight. Earlier plot points they'd established made it so Heidelin destroyed the unsundered world, which players ended up more captivated by and sympathetic to than the team expected. So if the audience is to love her, she needed a good reason for the sundering, and the writers are contradictory about what that is, between maintaining a timeline, racial attributes, and a dead-end culture that wasn't sufficiently substantiated, while also compromising Shadowbringer's messaging. It might not matter to people who weren't interested in the unsundered world or its characters, but for those who were, it makes its destruction and consequences feel arbitrary and meaningless. Storytelling and execution can unintentionally put forth troubling messages through carelessness. Somewhere along the way, in attempting to tie all these threads together with the existing plot, they accidentally wrote a social Darwinist ideologue with genocide apologism that encouraged the dehumanization of the ancients, which appears to have hit them belatedly judging by the Q&A, where Yoshida wanted to communicate that Heidelin's not a bad guy. I'd also like to note that in avoiding the supposed trope of making Venat an anti-villain, Endwalker is littered with other more egregious tropes to compensate for their subversion of expectations, not just broken Aesops. The writing choices surrounding Venat and most of Endwalker are inscrutable. There are numerous details that could have been changed to absolve her of guilt without needing drastic rewrites, but instead they opted to portray her as deliberately orchestrating events, despite most of them being actively harmful to others. The issue isn't merely an absence of facts, but the presence of facts that counter the premise, which require audience dismissal. It begs the question why the writers left so many openings for her to be interpreted as not being a good person, especially as she's so intricately woven within the fabric of the lore and setting. You can't ignore her or her ideals going forward. The narrative's strange moral compass has now become distracting, particularly when the so-called epilogue of the Omicron quests shows forgiveness, understanding, and salvation for the dead ends, and still nothing for the ancients, for whom that fate was only a distant possibility. No catharsis is offered for those who felt their tragedy was unjust. It would seem the writers, much like Venat, were so intent on getting rid of the ancients, they were willing to sacrifice everything in the world building to do it. Another factor in what makes people upset is they feel their warrior of light is complicit in what happened. Despite being affected by the ancients and their struggle, the warrior of light never questions the person who ended them. And it's difficult to believe they would only nod and smile at a person who has done so much harm and never answered for any of it, no matter how noble her intentions were. The discomfort many have described is due to feeling railroaded into agreeing with Venat that the massacre of the ancients was necessary and not putting forth any effort to try to save them despite being granted continuous opportunities. This is not helped by Endwalker following a time travel parallel in Shadowbringers, where history was rewritten at the potential risk of an entire timeline to save just one person. Venat and her decisions can be judged on their own merit, but when the game is telling the player your avatar is content to leave the ancients to their fate, it becomes a problem. This is why there's a clamoring for an alternate timeline, even if there's never any interaction with it. The existence of it would establish that the Warrior of Light isn't complicit and wanted to help the ancients instead of shrugging aside their deaths while still accepting quests from them. Per an interview with Twinfinite in August of 2019, Yoshida said Ishikawa wished to humanize the Asians and Emet-Selch and to explore them as characters instead of leaving their vision unclear. I can only speculate where the cracks formed, with Ishikawa having free rein with Shadowbringers to subvert the preconceived notions of the prior story installments without accounting or planning for what would follow. Perhaps Yoshida and/or other writers were inflexible or oblivious to what was happening and were unwilling to bend to the new story direction the audiences loved when it veered from their overall vision. Endwalker certainly felt like a hard course correction, especially following another statement of Ishikawa's in a September 2019 interview with VG247, where she said, "With the narrative of Shadowbringers, we focused on why so many people associate everything moral and virtuous with light. To some people, what may seem like the right of way or what's true or good for them might not necessarily be good for everyone. We had the concept of turning the light versus darkness motif on its head because we wanted players to consider how critical perspective is. Players have already seen how Eorzea's people view light as everything that is good. However, light is the mark of evil in Norvrant. The general impression I've gotten from reading interviews is that Ishikawa thinks of the story as a subjective piece, where no one is really right or wrong, while Yoshida sees it as more of a straightforward heroic fantasy. Comparing developer commentary between Shadowbringers and Endwalker would make you think two entirely different teams worked on them, because the storytelling philosophies expressed are so divergent. It's difficult to know who exactly is responsible for what components of Endwalker, but considering the material Ishikawa is confirmed to have written post 6.0, such as Omega Beyond the Rift and the Near Reincarnation crossover, along with her being the one pushing Grey for Hydaelyn to begin with, I'm not inclined to lay all the blame for Venat's characterization at her feet. I also doubt it was a coincidence Venat's namesake is an antagonist from Final Fantasy XII. However, we'll probably never know the details of what happened and what seems to have been a crowded writer's room. It feels like some of the writers are still dying on hills for their take on the story without considering how it impacts the broader picture. I saw it best described as listening to two different songs being played at the same time. In isolation, both are fine, but as one melody, it's discordant. What the team was aiming for seemed to be an inspiring, encouraging story of everyone past and present, regardless of alignment, joining hands and uniting in purpose to save the star. More importantly, they all believe in and support you. You can see the potential of Venat loving the Warrior of Light's experiences and journey so much that she makes the decision to affirm it and ensure it happens as something well-meaning and intended to be validating. I don't doubt that Endwalker had sincere intentions in uplifting the player, but as a result of the expansion being rushed, ill-planned, with Hydaelyn tunnel vision, and seemingly a goal to course-correct everything that made Shadowbringers compelling, they did it in a way that presumed the player was a self-centered, self-serving person. The story also threw everything it possibly could at the way it portrayed the Sundering to soften Venat's actions, which were explicitly intended to annihilate an entire race of people by dehumanizing her victims, then using abstraction techniques to obscure the violence and identity violation she inflicted. The previous expansion's emotional impact depended upon understanding the victims of the Sundering were people and empathizing with them as such. So if your perspective is centered around those Venat harmed, then everything immediately becomes a horror show. It's also a matter of value judgments. If you value loyalty, honesty, and believe the quality of life is worth more than the mere existence of life, you probably won't sympathize with Venat. You can believe in moral complexity and still believe Venat was wrong if you consider her actions to be antithetical to your own moral framework. The obvious issue with this is it makes those players feel like they're no longer on the same page ethically as the writers. Storylines going forward are either going to return to the values of everything prior, where Endwalker becomes a strangely hypocritical outlier, or they're going to continue pushing a value system where those same people not only can't relate to their character and companions, they're also going to feel they're not good people in what's supposed to be a heroic fantasy. Dialogue options since 6.0 have also not been subtle about forcing a perspective through limited choices, which is only going to create further dissonance. When you have to ask, how do we justify this genocide, frankly, you're already headed the wrong direction as far as storytelling goes. Putting that aside, the more controversial a plot element, the tighter the plot has to be to get people to accept it in good faith. And genocide was the right choice to save the world is about as controversial as it gets. Word of God communicating Hydaelyn's not a bad guy, demanding you ignore the inconvenient details, doesn't work for those who can't just roll with the vibes of intent. I've seen it said the level of anger directed at Venat far exceeds any other character in 14, because her level of importance to the story far exceeds any other character in 14. Every decision she made is foundational to the entirety of the lore and world building. Genocide is always wrong, and Venat committed genocide, therefore Venat was wrong, that difficult a concession to make? Apparently so, because Yoshida now parades around in a jacket that celebrates Hydaelyn and glorifies a crime against mankind, showing they either don't get it or don't care. Bad news for those who felt the messaging that came out of the writing surrounding her, even if unintentional, was deeply unsettling and grossly unethical. Venat failed because she was too transparent in both the admiration the writers had for her and her role as a fix for the previously established story. She's whatever she needs to be at the moment, oscillating between whatever makes you like her and making the plot work somehow. Rather than a nuanced anti-villain, they decided to double down on the affection, possibly out of concern a betrayal would be too dark. The only change needed to achieve this is that Hydaelyn tempers, and Endwalker instantly makes perfect sense. Venat is a mix of fear of experimentation and desire to finish everything with their favorite character, and to such an extent I could argue Final Fantasy XIV is now Venat's story, and the Warrior of Light is merely the vehicle through which it's told.
That concludes today's lesson on long-forgotten history. Though I imagine your mother would offer a rather contradictory account, as is her wont.